had used a grateful patient story. And I do also teach that protocol in an online course, and I also sell products. I'd like to circle back to the patient that I wrote the book KetoCONTINUUM about. KetoCONTINUUM was a sparked idea when that tsunami of patients was asking to come see me, and I was in line to get my son picked up from middle school in South Dakota, where it is February and all windows are frozen shut. And someone comes up and pushes the book any way you can to the window and says, "Did you write this?" And Sioux Falls is one of the, well, it's the largest city in South Dakota, but I think I might have recognized this woman, but I couldn't tell you that. And she's yelling at me through the window because you can't roll them down. And I said, "Well, get in." And so she sits in the passenger seat as she goes on to tell me that she was just released from the hospital. There's a very thick Brazilian accent. She goes, "You know what they fed me in hospital?" I'm like, "What?" "They fed me pudding."
Pudding.
I'm so sorry. She goes, "I need to be your patient." I'm like, "Oh no." Not only was every warning bell going off in my mind, but my staff will kill me if I say yes to one more patient right now. We are so overbooked. I am one human being. And I said, "No, you do not need a doctor to be on a ketogenic diet." And she goes, "Well, then you need to lead a class, and I will be your first student." And I had frequently been thinking the problem with the ketogenic diet is that it is much like the other addictions that I was walking patients through, and for which we had a free support group every week, led by either the physician or the counselor every week. And that process was one of the best predictors to know who was actually going to be sober from their addiction at a year. How many of the meetings did they attend? So I said yes, and we were squatters in the basement of the place where I rented office space. There was no one in that facility. And we set up some folding chairs in February without heat, and we started a support group. Every Friday, free to the community, and David showed up. And when David walked in, he hadn't seen a physician in over 15 years, and he was one of the people that was going to be a statistic. The year was 2015, and 2016, February of 2016, and the data that you're about to see, he was top smack in the middle of this. The top killers in America are heart disease, cancer, accidents, lung disease, strokes, Alzheimer's, diabetes, influenza, kidney disease, and suicide. He'd be in that top 10. He was 70 pounds overweight, shorter than I am, and he was unaware that one of the lab numbers that he should be following was out of whack. There is one number that, when looking at patient care, predicts 8 of the top 10 of these illnesses. The ones in red all are a predictor, all are predicted by one laboratory. Your insurance regulates how often I can check that. It is also very interested if you pay for it in cash. They'd like to know the answer. Your actuary tables will be strikingly adjusted if you say, "I just want to pay cash." Insurance company still gets that data. And it is my objective in this lecture to show you not only what this lab is, but why you should care about it, and how you should take responsibility for checking it yourself until it's normal. So, our conversation begins in your bone marrow. Deep within your bones, you make these things, red blood cells. They are disc-shaped cells, and they are unique. They do not have a nucleus, that's the brain power of every other cell. and they do not have mitochondria. You mix cholesterol, fat, protein together and make these disc-shaped cells filled with these structures. Globin. Millions of strings of globin partner with millions of heme, those yellow cups. Now add a little iron, and you've got globin plus heme plus iron, which is your hemoglobin. These weave together to have a carrying basket for oxygen. That's their job. That's the only thing they're supposed to be doing with 100% precision and accuracy, and don't get in their way to deliver this. It's a commodity that is required for every cell. These bundles pile into your red blood cells by the millions. And for 120 days, these saucers zip around your body, delivering oxygen. Erythrocytes, the other name for red blood cells, are to transport these heme units. And they supply the oxygen, and it's pretty darn important. Again, 8 of 10 of those top 10 diseases I can predict from a lab that is linked to your hemoglobin. They take off on a roller coaster ride of a lifetime. Their job is to ensure that this commodity, oxygen, gets to your tissues. The red blood cells circulate around, they exit out of your bone marrow, and within your blood, they end up in this tiny little spot where oxygen comes into our body. This is your alveoli inside your lungs. Say, yes, that's a lovely drawing. That took me a long time. This gas enters into your circulation. But inside that place where you trade the gaseous waste product called carbon dioxide, it exits the blood in this spot while oxygen enters. However, the commodity of carbon dioxide it's loosey-goosey. It doesn't have an attachment. It kind of diffuses in the serum, or that liquid part of your blood that's not the red blood cell. And it will swim along with the rest of your liquid until it gets to the lungs, and then out of the lungs it comes and you breathe it out with water. Oxygen is not that liberal. It has rules, and it's following the rules. Because if you put oxygen into the blood like those little molecules are now, those pink cells along the wall will gobble it up. They'll take whatever oxygen is closest to them and use it. So in order to get that oxygen to your toes, or your brain, or any other part of your body, it needs to be strapped on to hemoglobin. It is that important of a commodity. So take that iron, heme, and globin, and those oxygen molecules go into a seat, and it is mandated for the delivery. If those oxygen molecules get a little low by the time it gets to the certain part of your body, diseases happen, specifically chronic diseases. And if those tissues are low on oxygen, that's when these 10 diseases start to hit. The most deadly reason that David is going to die. Go back to them. So let me list them, because I think as I look around this room and I've really struggled to say, is this the best lecture for the audience? I just want you to hold on to one of these diseases that might be in your future. Heart disease, cancers, chronic lung disease, that means emphysema, returning pneumonias, asthma, strokes, Alzheimer's, diabetes, influenza. This was data in 2017, pre-COVID when this hit. And then kidney disease. So, how are these 8 diseases linked to this one? Well, there's an enemy in this story. We get to blame a molecule. This molecule is permeable to your red blood cells. It can go in and out of the red blood cells without anyone's permission. It is not inhibited. The concentration of this molecule outside the red blood cell is the same as it is inside your red blood cell. It does dissolve in that same part that the carbon dioxide is dissolved in, but it also will hide in your red blood cells. Every other cell in your body has a receptor, except for red blood cells, that lifts this molecule from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. Every other cell needs the permission of some endocrine in order to function. Any guesses what this molecule is? Thank you very much. This is glucose. Your glucose is the determining factor for whether or not your hemoglobin is going to work right. So there's our hemoglobin, or there's our red blood cell with glucose permeable to its cell. And it is your red blood cell that is constantly exposed for 100 to 120 days to what is your average blood glucose. The trouble that links it to those problems is a mistake can happen. It is a magnetic mistake, meaning there's no enzyme. It's rather concentration-based. But if that glucose gets too close to the iron inside that heme cup, that yellow cup, the glucose pushes the oxygen out of the way and gets stuck to that iron. It's like a magnetic pair, and it is irreversible. For the life of that red blood cell, it will stay there. This process is called glycation. Glycation is, again, non-enzymatic. There's no enzyme involved. It is irreversible. You can't undo it. You can't go with a crowbar and get that piece of glucose like gum on your shoe off of your hemoglobin. You're going to have to carry it for the lifetime of that red blood cell. And it is concentration dependent. So it gets stuck like gum to the bottom of your shoe. And now your consequence is, well, how compromised are you because of that glucose? So here's your red blood cell, diving in again, splatting on our oxygen, and looking very closely. Once our seat gets glycated from a glucose molecule, it will take the death of that red blood cell before you get to use that part again. It goes into the spleen, gets recycled, and then you can push reset. So if on the first day out of your bone marrow, the sugar was so high that the glycation or the splatting of your hemoglobin happens, you compromised your oxygen delivery. And it is in that oxygen delivery that we see a decrease in the carrying capacity of your oxygen to tissues. When there isn't enough oxygen to go around, the organ doesn't die. You don't notice. But that aging process deep within the cells, call it a telomere length, call it a body age score, but it's deep within your cells that there is a stress going on, and your system is making the choice to compromise those cells because there wasn't enough to go around. So our woven basket of oxygen. Just take a moment to praise how beautiful that hemoglobin is. But what I really care to know is how glycated is your hemoglobin? The light bulbs seem to come on for a few people. This test that looks at your hemoglobin and how much sugar is on it is related to its approximation to the glucoses in your circulation. So say out loud, what's the name of this test? A1C. Amen. Glycated hemoglobin A1C is the name of the test that predicts the 8 top 10 killers in our country. It is a tested percentage that we are looking at. So let's take that and unpack it. For those of you that are a little scientific, we do have that these are erythrocytes. They are permeable to glucose. It is a non-enzymatic reaction that is irreversible, that lasts the lifetime of that cell. It and it is the predictor of the oxygen delivery for each of the tissues within the human body. So we have 100 seats here filled with oxygen. This is a mathematical equation for how much percent of your seats are glycated. So let's start with 4% of those seats are glycated. So we have 4 little cells that bounce onto your oxygen, taking it away for the lifetime of this red blood cell. That turns into a hemoglobin A1C of 4. If you're really dialing in, I'll say it's 4.000 to the third decimal point. Take a guess, what is the average glucose for a glycated hemoglobin A1C of 4%? Say it loud. 60. Oh, there you go. 68 is the, oopsie, I didn't mean to push that so fast. I'm so sorry. The average there was 68. My finger got a little jumpy there. Yes, 68 was the average, which means that the typical blood sugars were between 50 and 80. The bell-shaped curve for that number does reach down to 40s for a few hours in the month. And it also tips into the 80s for a few hours in the month. And that's not most of us. In fact, that's pretty low. Not unheard of, but pretty low. And I would contend that the people whose hemoglobin A1C is 4 have something wrong with the lifetime of their red blood cells, not really that it's 4% of an average. So there are some setbacks or some things you need to think about when you're looking at your average hemoglobin A1C. So here's what that person, if it was an accurate measurement, would look like after a meal. So if their average glucose was just under 70, you would have the moment where they ate the food, the sugar would rise, and at about 2 to 2.5 hours, the blood sugar would be back to normal. Okay, let's flat another seat in our hemoglobin, because that's not where most of us live. So if we add 5, our next blood sugar, and we have 5.000, take a guess what glucose that is. That is a 97%. 97.2.
Oh.
And when we look at the bell-shaped curve for average of that hemoglobin A1C, it's between 80 and 120. But for a few hours of the month, you'll see them in the 60s. And a few hours of the month, you'll see them at 45. So notice how long it takes most healthy people to return to baseline. This is a very important key to what's going on hidden behind the health of most of the people that come to see me, that come to see Dr. Cyrus. How long does it take your sugar to return to normal? And when it goes high, how high does it actually peak? The more glycated your oxygen seats, the higher your average was. So for an average of 97, your sugar shot up to somewhere around 140, and they returned to normal around that 3 to 4 hour range. If we take that same data, that same type of patient, and we stretch it over a 24-hour period, a healthy person, again, an average blood sugar of around 100 is what we're using for our healthy patient here. Their morning meal is at 6 a.m., and again at noon, and again at 4 in the afternoon, just because it worked really well with the math. By 8:30 that night, their blood sugars have lowered to that baseline again. And the number remains low until their brain triggers cortisol the next morning when you see a little blip. It is a little blip in the healthy patient. Most of us are not that healthy. If you've been more than 10 pounds overweight for more than 5 years, it is likely that your dawn phenomenon still has consequences found in your morning sugars. Our blood sugars may start out in that 85 to 90 range, but how much insulin is it taking to keep that controlled? How much has your body been working to not let your hemoglobin get glycated. Because we're talking about hemoglobin in this lesson, but other things in your body are glycated. That crick in your neck that keeps hurting is more highly associated with an elevated blood sugar. Meniere's disease, which is the constant ringing, is more likely because of elevated hemoglobin A1Cs and the glycation that happens within the ear. Sugar and our ability to measure it in this very accessible protein that floats around our blood, drips out of our finger when we prick it, is a fantastic access to how glycated the rest of your body is. The morning blood sugars under 100 are a sign of health, but what we aren't measuring is, well, what happened when they were sleeping? How long did it take them to get to baseline? Eating in a window between 6 and 4 p.m. is perfectly prescribed, but difficult to do. Deep within your chemistry is what we're trying to look at, and that's where the answers are for the continuum of health that happens when you try to reverse the metabolic problems found in the patients that come in the doors of our clinics. So an eating window is something I have started having patients measure. First bite in, first bite out. It's several of the workbook pages because they don't fix this in 21 days of a habit forming. They really do take their child development, their social structure, their support system, their current stress, their depth of sleep, that will impact how they decide what their eating window will be today. So as I look at the percentages, if we add another of our hemoglobins and splat it with glucose, we now have a hemoglobin A1C of 6. Any guesses what this number is? 126, which is the same number that if you come in and your blood sugar is 126 while fasting, we call this diabetes. But the average is a hemoglobin A1C. And the number of people that have written into me over the last 8 to 9 months, because I have been talking about hemoglobin A1C a lot, Doc, my hemoglobin A1C is 6. I'm fine. The doctor says I'm fine. But the number of gummed up seats and the correlation to those top 8 pillars is still very measurable. It is a linear connection. When we take up 7 seats, we go to 154. When we bump to 8 seats, we're in the 180s. And 9 seats, we go to 211. And as this goes up, imagine how much of the oxygen delivery is being compromised. And when the diabetic says, but doc, my foot feels fine. I don't understand why it's not healing. And we offer him a hyperbaric oxygen chamber because we just need the oxygen to get to the tissue. And your delivering basket is all gummy because of your average blood sugars. So raise your hand if you know what your hemoglobin A1C is. Okay. So watch carefully over these next few slides. No questions?
Yeah. My doctor does measure something she calls A1C, and of course we all hear about it in commercials. Is that different from what you're talking about?
Oh, that's a great question. He asks, is A1C the same as hemoglobin A1C? Yes. Oh. In fact, the way the glycated hemoglobin A1C got its label was because it's the protein that's labeled A1 in the C position, which is where we are measuring specifically is the glucose bound. But the glycation and the hemoglobin, they're everywhere and they're part of that cycle. So A1C is what we're talking about. All right, watch closely to see if you can find your hemoglobin A1C in these next few slides. Because it is a very gradation of the percentage. That I've shown you the whole numbers in these previous slides, but they go out to the 3rd decimal point because there are millions of hemoglobins. There are millions of billions of heme units on those globin chains. And it is a percentage of how many of them have been glycated to watch where you landed on this scale of hemoglobin A1C. A few years ago, labs across the country allowed you to order your tests directly from the lab. At LabCorp or Quest across the country, it ranges between $40 to $80 to go in and say, I would like to check my own hemoglobin A1C. And like I said earlier, your insurance company really likes it if you do that. Yeah. They don't like to pay for it, but they will use it in a projection for your insurance company. Having a recent advancement in the way that I think medicine is going, which is get me out of the way. Give the access to the patient, let them do it at home, and let them do it privately without Big Brother snooping down what is the number. Because it is you that should care. Insurances really care. Actuary tables unbelievably care. But getting an average hemoglobin A1C is the fastest way to say, what have my sugars been on average the past month? And notice I didn't say 3 months, but month. The average per month changes the number. It is mathematical, so we'll get to that in a second. But let's look at some of the pros and cons about how people are looking to find their average blood sugars. So the first, point of care, meaning you don't need me. Go click on ForCare, buy a device, get some strips, and test your blood sugars. And when you look at the pros and cons of blood sugars and checking your own blood sugars, yes, it's easy. It's relatively cheap. It is portable. You can take it wherever you go. Some of the cons are you do have to poke your finger. And it does, it's not something you can check while you're sleeping. I like to say that it is selection bias. Anybody who I've had plot their blood sugars over the course of time, they usually have a nice, lovely metric coming out of their meter at the beginning, and it's got ranges that are pretty awful. And then the next time, it's so lovely. Their A1C didn't change. And that's because if they ate something naughty, they did not check their sugars. Selection bias happens with every person, me included. Like, oh, yep, not looking there. So we do have, so then we do have the continuous glucose monitors. You've heard folks talk about those over the last couple of days. CGM is what they're referring to with those little letters. It is a device that is in your subcutaneous fat. They aren't measuring the actual glucose in the serum or the part that's floating outside your red blood cells. But that's the unique part about our human bodies is the sugar inside your subcutaneous fat is pretty close to what's going on inside your blood vessels. So looking at that, you've got one that's called Dexcom 6 and the other one that's the Freestyle Libre. Having had access to both of these, they're both amazing experiments that do have immediate feedback for what you're doing and what your body is seeing. I think the Dexcom 6 has a higher advantage because of its continuous check, meaning it does check it while you sleep. You don't need to wave it over your arm like you do the Libre. So once again, that selection bias really does happen. The Libre does have a little easier access. For patients, you can buy it for a 2-week interval, and it's really under $200 or about somewhere between $150 and $200 across the different pharmacies. And as long as the doctor writes that it is for experimental testing, there's no problem with that. Both of these do require a prescription. If you have diabetes, even if you don't have diabetes and you're trying to get it from most pharmacists, the test I was telling people about the other day where if you tell them it's for experimental or research purposes, meaning you're doing research on an N of 1 yourself, they don't like that. Several pharmacists say, nope, give me a prescription. So, again, the selection bias was there, but comparing the costs, they are pretty expensive either way if you get into the long-term uses of them. This is not using some of the hacks I talked about the other day. But you do have to poke your finger still. People think I never have to do that again, but you really do need to calibrate these, and if they're not calibrated, they don't work. So you don't really get out of that. But much less, but still do have to have a monitor. So as I look at the next comparison, which is where I think there's quite an advantage. That is a glycated hemoglobin A1C. It can be done in office or at home now. And it is a true average, provided your red blood cells don't have things like thalassemias or my favorite Ken Berry hack to lower your A1C was to get a blood transfusion, to give blood. I thought, oh, that's so clever. That did not decrease your heart disease. But it was, I laughed out loud. For insurance purposes, you might want to do that. But you can actually now get a system that has you check your hemoglobin A1C on a card at home, where you prick your finger and you drip blood onto a sponge card. The sponge card is mailed into the facility, and they run it through their analysis to tell you how many of your hemoglobin in the A1C position are glycated, or gummed up with sugar. Again, no one else needs to see this. It is yours to look at, and I contend that oops, I didn't mean to push that again too, sorry. Oh my, that's a little touchy. It's still up there, okay. That the hemoglobin A1C process of improving your blood sugars doesn't just happen with a change in behavior one day. That the courage of the last speaker and how delicate and how psychological food is to us was a very brave story, and I have patients who have extreme stories like that where they can't tell them behind a closed exam room door, let alone in front of people, that it really could change other people's lives by sharing how vulnerable we are, how attached to food we are, and what that does to our health. That when I look at offering different metrics to patients and saying, what is the way that you can improve your health? Checking a hemoglobin A1C until you get a number much closer to blood sugars that are an average around 100. Or in my personal case, my goal is to have an average blood sugar of 83, which is a hemoglobin A1C of 4.5. And that's not arbitrary. That is from studying the literature and looking that disease severity isn't just for mom and dad. Disease severity starts in our children. It gets to our teenagers. And of course, everyone in this room is here because it's either impacted you or someone you love. That when I look at the diseases that are related to children, this is not an inclusive list, but it is a list that is linked to the higher their hemoglobin A1C, the greater this disease process. For babies born to diabetic mothers, their irritability, their lack of stage 4 sleep, which is how their brains develop, their increased risk of obesity, heart disease, and delayed mental processing through learning or even social skills is very easily connected. It goes on to link autism, panic attacks, depression. As teenagers get involved, we begin to look at what it does to their endocrine systems, that young boys don't become the men of the last generation, not by accident, but because their endocrine system is blunted from the excessive sugar that's in their systems. That it's not just their waistlines, it's their brain development and their testosterone that, I have a great statement, but I won't say it out loud. That our men need to be men. They need to have the role in the home. As a mother raising 3 sons, it is a very delicate world out there for strong men to be rising up in a population where that is not vogue to be strong. As you look on to the adults in the room, we hack into their menstrual cycles, their miscarriages, their pregnancy mishaps, their inability to get pregnant, obesity, diabetes, reflux disease, and then as the severity grows higher, the immune system becomes involved. And in the book, Any Way You Can, you'll see that the immune system of the patient, the backstory is around, it compromised her white blood cells to the point where she had cancer throughout her body for over 10 years. She had perfect health care because I delivered it for 10 years.
Wow.
And when she said, when I said that she needed chemotherapy again because her white blood cells were doubling at such a rate that the cancer would take her life if she didn't do chemotherapy. She would be dead in 6 months. When she said no, the most important question that I've only asked a handful of patients is, I asked her, do you trust me? And her first response was flippant, of course I trust you. I said, no, it's your whole life you trust me. Let me show you what I would do if I was a 71-year-old female with 10 years of chronic lymphocytic leukemia, at 45 pounds overweight for the better part of the last 12 years. And you were 6 months with chemo. You didn't change things. The patient was my mother. And we drove home to our family farm, 100 miles away from a hospital. And we did the worst version of the ketogenic diet I've ever done. I learned about the ketogenic diet as fast as I could with all the skepticism that you'll find in those first 3 chapters. That if you're looking for a way to convince a physician to relook at the literature, give them, read the book, and then gift it to them. Those first 3 chapters will show you where the basis of the literature comes from, that not only is hemoglobin A1C an incredible predictor of your future health, but it is also the literature also shows that the evidence behind aging does not need to be the way that we're doing it. And we have several options out there where patients have been on a ketogenic diet for 45 years, mandated, because when they went off of the diet, they had a seizure. And they're called the ketogenic kids. They were put on this ketogenic diet in the 60s, and I write about that in the first few chapters of that book. And there was no pharma involved. The follow-up for their cases was autopsy. Fantastic, because pharma can't mess with that. And the data was brain envy, that they died with a brain that I would be envious of. And these were chronic seizures in their childhood patients. The evidence is very clear out there what aging your body in a healthy manner looks like. I contend that when you need the evidence to help your physician say, I would like to improve my health by using a ketogenic diet, to reach for several of these studies that look at your hemoglobin A1C is lower, the health is better.